In New Orleans' historic Velvet Lily Jazz Lounge, a young waiter was about to bump shoulders with brutality itself. A routine night of drinks and jazz turned deadly when Dominic, the Jackal, Moretti's criminal entourage, took offense to spilled wine and answered it with shattered bones. Seagal wasn't your typical quiet patron nursing bourbon at the back booth. For decades, he had been a Navy SEAL and aikido master, known for subduing enemies with nothing but discipline and resolve. When Moretti smashed the waiter's face into a table, he had no idea he was provoking a man who defined restraint until pushed too far. Seagal rose with calm finality, unleashing a tactical response that would shatter the illusion of Moretti's untouchable reign. What began as a spilled glass of wine would become a reckoning decades overdue. The Velvet Lily and the city beneath. It would never be the same after one old warrior stood up while everyone else stayed seated. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. New Orleans breathed humid jazz into the night air as the Velvet Lily Jazz Lounge pulsed with the kind of rhythm that only comes from generations of music seeping into brick walls and cypress floors. The historic club sat like a jewel in the French Quarter, its neon sign casting purple shadows across cobblestone streets, while inside crystal chandeliers threw amber light over polished mahogany tables where the city's complicated elite gathered every Friday night to pretend civility still mattered in a world where it had long since died. Marina Dubois moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to smile. While her stomach churned with anxiety, she wore a midnight blue dress that hugged her elegant frame, her dark hair swept up in a style that would have made her late father proud if he could see what his beloved club had become beneath the surface beauty. At 42, Marina carried herself with the poise of old New Orleans money, but her eyes held the haunted knowledge of someone who had made too many compromises. With the wrong people, she paused at table after table, exchanging pleasantries with oil executives and district attorneys and casino owners, all of whom nodded with the careful respect accorded to someone who knew where the bodies were buried. The stage glowed softly as Celeste warmed up her voice. She was a woman in her early 30s with skin the color of cafe au lait and eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow and hope of the Mississippi Delta. Her voice, when she sang, could make grown men weep or lift spirits crushed by the weight of living in a city where corruption wore three-piece suits and called itself progress. Tonight, she adjusted the microphone with delicate fingers, testing the sound with scales that floated through the club like smoke from expensive cigars. Near the back corner booth, Steven Seagal sat alone, nursing a glass of bourbon that had barely been touched. His weathered face was partially hidden in shadow, but his eyes missed nothing. They swept the room with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades learning to read danger in the smallest gestures. The way a man held his cigarette, the angle of a woman's shoulders, the pitch of laughter that tried too hard to sound natural. He wore simple black jeans and a dark button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked with the subtle scars of a life spent in disciplines both martial and moral. Nothing about him announced importance, no entourage, no flashy jewelry. Just the quiet presence of a man who had learned that true power required no advertisement. The front door opened with a rush of humid air, and the energy in the room shifted like a barometric pressure drop before a storm. Dominic, the Jackal, Moretti, entered with the liquid confidence of a predator who had never encountered meaningful resistance. He was tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair slicked back, and a white linen suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. Behind him came his shadow, Antoine Tank Baptiste, a mountain of a man whose heavily tattooed arms suggested a history of violence that extended far beyond the boundaries of legal combat. Tank moved with surprising grace for someone his size, his eyes constantly scanning the room like a security camera programmed to detect threats. Marina's smile tightened almost imperceptibly as she glided toward them, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with metronomic precision. Dominic, she said, her voice carrying just enough warmth to seem genuine. Your usual table is ready. She gestured toward a corner booth that offered clear sight lines to every entrance and exit. Moretti's lips curved in what might have been a smile, if smiles could contain that much calculated menace. Marina, darling, you always take such good care of me, he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey and twice as dangerous "The music sounds exceptional tonight, much better than last week." The compliment carried a veiled reminder of his previous complaint, one that had resulted in Marina firing a bartender who had worked there for 8 years. Detective Ray Coltrane sat 3 tables away nursing a scotch and trying to look like just another off-duty cop unwinding. After a long shift, his badge and service weapon were concealed beneath a rumpled blazer, but his eyes held the perpetual wariness of someone who had seen too much and compromised too often. At 51, Coltrane carried the weight of 23 years on the New Orleans Police Department, most of them spent watching good intentions get ground down by a system that rewarded looking the other way. He had been tracking Moretti for 3 years, watching him slip through procedural cracks with the help of expensive attorneys and witnesses who suddenly developed severe memory problems behind the bar. Jacob Jax Tran wiped down glasses with mechanical precision, his sharp eyes cataloging every face in Moretti's entourage, mentally updating the informal intelligence network that kept the club's staff informed about which customers to handle with extra care. At 26, Jax had grown up in the nearby Vietnamese Creole neighborhood, where survival depended on knowing when to speak and when to disappear into the background. He had been working at the Velvet Lily for 4 years, long enough to recognize the signs of trouble before they fully materialized. Near the entrance, Elias Washington stood with the patient stillness of someone who had learned to read the city's moods like weather patterns. At 73, the former blues guitarist had been working the door at the Velvet Lily for over a decade, his gruff exterior hiding a grandfather's protective instincts toward the younger staff members. His eyes held the accumulated wisdom of someone who had watched New Orleans change from a city of music and magic into something harder and more dangerous. Luis Hernandez hurried between tables carrying a tray of drinks with the careful concentration of someone whose entire world balanced on steady hands. At 23, he was new to the job, having moved from San Antonio just 6 months earlier, chasing the promise of opportunity in a city that seemed to vibrate with possibility. His eager energy stood out in an establishment where most people had learned to temper their enthusiasm with caution. He moved with the awkward grace of someone still learning the rhythm of fine service, his eyes bright with the hope that hard work and dedication would eventually pay off. The band finished their warm-up set, and Celeste stepped to the microphone, her voice flowing through the club like honey over broken glass. She began with a bittersweet ballad about choices and consequences, about the price of staying silent when silence became complicity. The lyrics seemed to hang in the air like incense, carrying meanings that went deeper than the surface romance. As the last note faded into the humid night air, Moretti snapped his fingers with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been refused anything. The sound cut through the music like a blade, and Luis immediately straightened his shoulders, squaring with the determination of someone eager to prove himself worthy of the job he had traveled so far to find. The night had settled into its familiar rhythm when disaster struck with the sudden violence of a summer thunderstorm. Luis balanced his tray with practiced concentration, weaving between tables filled with New Orleans society. The crystal glasses caught the stage lights, sending prismatic reflections across faces both elegant and predatory. He moved with the careful steps of someone who understood that his family's future rested on his ability to navigate this world without stumbling. A well-dressed socialite at table 7 pushed her chair back, without warning, reaching for her purse with the unconscious entitlement of someone who had never considered that other people might be sharing her space. Her elbow caught Luis in the ribs, and his carefully balanced world tilted toward catastrophe. The tray wavered, glasses sliding toward the edge like ships abandoning a sinking deck, and time stretched into that terrible slow-motion moment when disaster becomes inevitable. The wine glass tumbled through the air, red liquid arcing like blood against the amber lights. Most of it splashed harmlessly against the floor, but a crimson stream found its target, splashing across Dominic Moretti's pristine white linen jacket and spattering onto his Italian leather shoes. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the band stopped mid-note, as if the universe itself had paused to witness what would happen next. Luis froze, his face draining of color as he stared at the spreading stain across Moretti's jacket. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, while his hands trembled with the knowledge that his life had just taken a turn towards something dark and irreversible. "I'm so sorry, sir," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please let me." He reached for the napkins tucked into his waistband, but never got the chance to finish the gesture. Moretti moved with the sudden violence of a striking snake. His hand shot out, gripping Luis by the throat and lifting him partially off his feet. The young man's eyes bulged as his windpipe compressed, cutting off his air supply. His feet scraped against the floor in a desperate attempt to find purchase, while glasses continued to crash around them like the sound of breaking dreams. "You stupid piece of shit," Moretti hissed, his voice carrying in the dead silence that had fallen over the club. "Do you have any idea what this jacket costs? More than you'll make in a year, you pathetic little worm." His fingers tightened around Luis's throat, and the young man's face began to turn purple, his hands clawing desperately at Moretti's wrist. Marina gripped the edge of the bar so hard her knuckles turned white. Her face had drained of all color as she watched her father's dream club transform into a scene from her worst nightmares. She wanted to move, wanted to scream, wanted to call for help, but her voice seemed trapped in her throat by the same fear that had kept her silent for too many years. Detective Coltrane's hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek, but he hesitated, caught between his sworn duty and the cold reality of a corrupt system that would crucify him for interfering with one of its protected predators. His fingers hovered over his gun, while his conscience warred with his survival instincts. From behind the bar, Jax watched in horror, his hands frozen in the motion of drawing a glass. The young bartender had seen violence before, had grown up in neighborhoods where it was as common as rain, but this was different. This was the kind of casual cruelty that came from absolute power, corrupting absolutely. Tank Baptiste stood near the wall, his massive frame tense with the readiness for violence that had become his profession, but his eyes held something unexpected, a flicker of discomfort that suggested somewhere beneath the layers of scar tissue and bad decisions there remained a fragment of the man who had once fought for sport rather than fear. Steven Seagal's eyes narrowed as he watched the scene unfold, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around his glass of bourbon. Somewhere in the deepest part of his mind, memories stirred of another time, another place, when he had watched violence unfold and done nothing, when his hesitation had cost innocent lives and left him carrying a burden that no amount of discipline could fully erase. Moretti wasn't finished with his demonstration of power. He pulled Luis upright, then slammed his face down onto the nearby table with sickening force. The young man's nose broke with an audible crack that seemed to echo through the stunned silence. Blood splattered across the white tablecloth like abstract art painted in pain and humiliation. When Moretti finally released him, Luis slid to the floor, conscious but dazed, blood streaming from his shattered nose, and mixing with tears of pain and shame, he curled into himself like a wounded animal, while Moretti brushed his hands together as if disposing of something distasteful. "Clean yourself up," Moretti said, his voice carrying the casual dismissal of someone discussing the weather, "and send someone competent with fresh drinks, someone who understands that service is a privilege, not a right." He turned to address the silent room, his smile returning as he spread his arms wide. "Well, the show's over. Nothing to see here, unless someone has a problem with how I handle disrespect in my city." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, but no one moved. Conversations resumed with the forced normalcy of people trying to pretend they hadn't witnessed something that would haunt their dreams. Glasses clinked with desperate cheer, and laughter rang out too loud and too sharp as the club's patrons retreated into the comfortable fiction that everything was normal. But in the corner booth, Steven Seagal continued to stare at the blood on the floor, his finger beginning to tap against his glass with the slow rhythm of a man whose legendary patience was beginning to crack. The Velvet Lily attempted to slip back into its familiar rhythm like a jazz band trying to find the beat after a missed note, but the discord lingered in the air, mixing with cigarette smoke and the metallic scent of blood that hadn't quite been cleaned from the floor. Celeste had returned to the stage, her voice trembling slightly as she began a mournful ballad about lost souls and second chances, but even her golden voice couldn't completely mask the tension that had settled over the room like a shroud. Marina sent Jax with a towel and a glass of water toward the kitchen where Luis had retreated to tend his wounds. She moved with the mechanical precision of someone in shock, her elegant facade cracking to reveal the guilt and fear that had been eating at her for months. Detective Coltrane approached the bar, his footsteps heavy with the weight of decisions he wished he didn't have to make. "Marina," he said, his voice low and urgent, We need to talk about what just happened, about how long you've been letting this go on." His eyes swept the room, checking to make sure Moretti and his crew weren't listening. "This can't continue. You know that right somewhere in your heart. You know this has to stop." Marina's hands shook as she poured herself a drink, bourbon, neat the same as her father used to drink when the weight of running the club became too much to bear. "What do you want me to say, Ray?" she whispered. "That I wanted this, that I chose to let my father's dream become a nightmare." Her voice cracked with the strain of holding back tears. "You think I don't know what this place has become? You think I don't see the fear in my employees' eyes every time that monster walks through the door? Then why Coltrane pressed? Why keep letting it happen? Why keep enabling him when you know what he's capable of?" His own voice carried the weight of someone who had made similar compromises and hated himself for it. "Marina, this isn't just about you anymore. That kid in there, he's got a family, people who depend on him." What happens when Moretti decides he's not satisfied with just breaking his nose? In the kitchen, Luis sat on a milk crate while Jax gently cleaned the blood from his face. The young waiter's hands trembled as he held a bag of ice against his swollen nose, his dreams of making something of himself in New Orleans crumbling like the fragments of bone in his shattered face. "I can't afford to lose this job," he whispered to Jax. "My mother, she needs her medication, and the rent is due next week. What am I supposed to do now?" Jax's expression hardened with the kind of street wisdom that came from growing up in neighborhoods where survival meant learning to read the signs of trouble before they fully materialized. "Listen to me, Luis," he said. "That's just how this place works. You keep your head down, you do your job, and you pray that guys like Moretti don't notice you exist. That's the price of working here. That's the price of working anywhere in this city when you're people like us." "But it's not right," Luis protested, his voice muffled by the ice pack. "What he did to me, it's not right." And everyone just sat there and watched. Nobody tried to help, nobody even called the police. Tears mixed with the blood on his face as the full weight of his powerlessness settled over him like a heavy blanket. "Right and wrong don't pay the bills," Jack said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sometimes you have to make choices that don't feel good just to survive. Sometimes you have to swallow your pride and your anger and your sense of justice just to make it through another day." Outside the kitchen door, Seagal stood in the shadows, listening to the conversation with the patience of a man who had learned to gather information before making decisions. His weathered face was impassive, but his eyes held the cold fire of someone whose conscience had been tested one too many times. He had spent decades trying to escape the violence that had defined his younger years, but moments like these reminded him that sometimes running away wasn't an option. He moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to walk without making sound, approaching the bar, where Marina and Coltrane continued their hushed conversation. His presence was like a shift in atmospheric pressure, subtle but unmistakable, and both of them turned to face him with the wariness of people who recognized something dangerous in his stillness. "Get your boy some real medical attention," Seagal said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "He needs more than paper towels and ice packs. That nose is going to need setting, and there might be other injuries, internal bleeding, concussion symptoms that won't show up for hours." Marina hesitated, her eyes darting toward Moretti's table where the crime boss was holding court with his usual audience of sycophants and enablers. "I can't," she whispered. "If I make a big deal out of this, if I call an ambulance or take him to the hospital, Moretti will see it as a challenge to his authority, and next time it won't just be a broken nose. Next time." Seagal repeated the words, hanging in the air like a threat. "You're already planning for there to be a next time. You're already accepting that this is going to happen again and again until that boy ends up in the morgue or someone else takes his place." Coltrane studied Seagal with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read danger in all its forms. "You're not from around here," he said. "You don't understand how things work in this city, the connections, the politics, the way the system protects people like Moretti from people like us." "I understand enough," Seagal replied, his gaze shifting to the kitchen where Luis sat, bleeding and broken. "I understand that sometimes the system fails, and when it does, good people have to make a choice between doing what's easy and doing what's right." His eyes met Coltrane's with the kind of directness that made the detective uncomfortable. "The question is which kind of person you want to be." Across the room, Tank Baptiste had been watching the conversation with growing unease, his massive frame shifting restlessly as some long-buried instinct warned him that the dynamics In the room were changing in ways that might not favor his employer. He leaned down to whisper in Moretti's ear, "Boss, that guy at the bar, the one talking to the cop, and the lady, he's been watching you all night, and not in a good way." Moretti's lips curved in a smile that held no warmth. "Is that so?" he said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a predator who had never encountered anything he couldn't crush. "Well then, maybe it's time we had a conversation about the rules of hospitality. In my city, Steven Seagal moved through the club with the deliberate calm of someone who had made a decision that couldn't be unmade. His footsteps were quiet, but purposeful, carrying him toward the kitchen where Luis sat hunched over his injuries. Like a wounded animal trying to hide from further harm, the young waiter looked up as Seagal approached, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from having your faith in human decency shattered in the span of a few violent seconds. "Easy, son," Seagal said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had comforted wounded soldiers on battlefields half a world away. "Let me take a look at that nose." He knelt beside Luis, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as they examined the damage. "You're going to need proper medical attention, but first we need to stop the bleeding and make sure you can breathe properly." Luis winced as Seagal adjusted his head position, tilting it forward to allow the blood to drain properly. "Why are you helping me?" he whispered. "Everyone else just pretended like nothing happened, like I deserved what I got for being clumsy. Because a long time ago someone helped me when I needed it," Seagal replied, his voice carrying the weight of memories that he rarely shared. "And because sometimes the only thing that stands between good people and the wolves is someone willing to draw a line in the sand and say this far and no further." Jax watched the interaction with growing amazement, his street-smart instincts telling him that this quiet stranger was different from the usual customers who frequented the Velvet Lily. There was something in Seagal's bearing that spoke of violence held in check, of power that didn't need to announce itself with loud words or flashy displays. "You don't understand," Jax said, his voice tight with the kind of fear that came from living under the thumb of men like Moretti. "That man out there, he owns this place. He owns half the cops in this city. And the other half are too scared to cross him. What you're doing right now, just being here talking to us, it's going to make things worse for everyone." Seagal's eyes met Jax's with the kind of directness that made the young bartender uncomfortable. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "How long have you been telling yourself that looking the other way is the only option? How long have you been swallowing your conscience and calling it survival?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Jax found himself unable to meet Seagal's gaze, his hands trembling as he reached for a bottle of whiskey that he didn't really need to clean. 2 years, he admitted. Maybe 3. It started small, just little things. Favoritism, special treatment for certain customers. Then it got worse and worse until he gestured helplessly toward Luis. Until this became normal. Normal, Seagal repeated the word like it tasted bitter in his mouth. "There's nothing normal about what happened here tonight, nothing acceptable about a grown man breaking a kid's nose over spilled wine, and nothing forgivable about a room full of people who watched it happen and did nothing." Marina appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale but determined. In her hands, she carried a first aid kit and a clean towel. "I called Dr. Rousseau," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "He'll come quietly, no questions asked, but it'll take him 20 minutes to get here." She looked at Seagal with something that might have been hope. "Can you keep him stable until then? I can do better than that," Seagal said, his voice carrying a promise that made the air in the kitchen feel charged with electricity. "I can make sure this never happens again." He stood slowly, his movements fluid and controlled like a predator preparing to strike. "But first I need to know something. Marina, are you ready to take your father's club back from the monsters who've been using it as their personal playground?" Marina's hands shook as she set down the first aid kit, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I've been ready for years," she said. "I just didn't know how. I just didn't think anyone would stand with me against him." "You won't be standing alone," Seagal said, his eyes moving between Marina and Jax and finally settling on Luis, who was watching the conversation with growing amazement. "But I need you to understand that once this starts, there's no going back. Moretti isn't going to just walk away quietly. He's going to come at you with everything he has, and you need to be ready for that." From the main room came the sound of laughter, loud and harsh, and deliberately meant to carry. Moretti's voice rose above the ambient noise of conversation and music. "Tank," he called out, "why don't you go have a word with our friend in the kitchen, the one who seems so interested in other people's business?" Make sure he understands the rules of hospitality in my establishment. Tank Baptiste pushed himself up from his chair with the reluctant obedience of someone who had learned that questioning orders was more dangerous than following them. But as he moved toward the kitchen, his steps were slower than usual, and his eyes held the troubled look of someone whose conscience was beginning to reassert itself after years of careful suppression. Seagal heard the approaching footsteps and turned to face the kitchen in trance, his body language shifting subtly from caregiver to warrior. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, like watching a house cat remember it was descended from tigers. Stay behind me, he said quietly to Luis and Marina and Jax. And whatever happens, don't try to interfere. This is about to get very ugly very quickly. Tank appeared in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space like a mountain of muscle and scar tissue. His eyes found Seagal, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition between men who had both chosen violence as their profession, but for very different reasons. Boss wants to see you, Tank said, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone delivering a message he didn't particularly want to deliver. Says you've been asking questions that aren't your business to ask. Seagal stepped forward, his movements fluid and precise. Tell your boss, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never backed down from a fight, that I'll be right out, and that he and I are going to have a conversation about the difference between strength and bullying. Tank's eyes narrowed as he processed the implications of Seagal's words. You sure you want to do this, old man? He asked. Because once you walk out of this kitchen, there's no walking back. Things are going to get settled one way or another. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I've been sure about this for longer than you know, Seagal replied, his voice carrying the weight of years of regret and the promise of redemption. The only question is whether you're going to be part of the problem or part of the solution. For a moment, Tank hesitated, his loyalty to Moretti warring with something deeper, something that remembered what it felt like to fight for honor instead of fear. But the moment passed, and he stepped aside, allowing Seagal to pass. Your funeral, he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and as Seagal walked past him toward the main room, Tank found himself wondering if he was about to witness the end of Dominic Moretti's reign of terror or the beginning of his own redemption. Steven Seagal walked across the Velvet Lily's main floor with the measured pace of a man who had crossed similar thresholds 1,000 times in places where the stakes were life and death and the margin for error was measured in heartbeats. The conversations around him died like candle flames in a sudden wind as patrons sensed something fundamental shifting in the room's atmosphere, their primitive survival instincts recognizing the approach of violence even before their conscious minds could process what they were witnessing. The jazz band faltered, then stopped entirely as Celeste's voice trailed off mid-note, her eyes wide with the kind of fascination that comes from watching a storm gather on a clear horizon. The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of Seagal's footsteps seemed to echo like gunshots against the hardwood floor, each step carrying him closer to a confrontation that would either end in redemption or catastrophe. Dominic Moretti watched Seagal's approach with the amused detachment of a cat observing a mouse that had somehow forgotten its place in the natural order. He leaned back in his chair, wine glass in hand, his lips curved in a smile that held all the warmth of a snake's embrace. Well, he said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed room. It seems we have a hero in our midst, someone who thinks the rules that apply to everyone else don't apply to him. Tank Baptiste positioned himself between Seagal and his employer, his massive frame blocking the path like a mountain of muscle and scar tissue that had been trained to crush anything that threatened his boss's authority. His hands hung loose at his sides, but his weight was balanced on the balls of his feet, ready to explode into violence at the first sign of trouble. Years of professional fighting had taught him to read opponents like a book, and what he read in Seagal's approach made his instincts scream warnings. This isn't your business, old man, Tank said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had delivered similar warnings countless times before. Mr. Moretti is having a private evening with friends, and he doesn't appreciate being interrupted by strangers who don't understand how things work in this city. So I'm going to give you one chance to turn around and walk away before this situation gets out of hand. Seagal stopped just outside Tank's reach, his eyes never leaving the bigger man's face as he evaluated the threat With the clinical precision of someone who had spent decades learning to measure violence in all its forms, Tank was strong, probably faster than his size suggested and definitely experienced, but there was something in his posture that spoke of doubt, something that suggested his loyalty to Moretti wasn't quite as absolute as it appeared. Move, Seagal said, the single word carrying more authority than most people could manage with entire speeches. This doesn't have to involve you, but if you choose to make it your fight, then you better be prepared for the consequences, because I'm not here to play games or exchange threats. I'm here to settle a debt. Tank's eyes narrowed as he processed the implications of Seagal's words. There was something in the older man's bearing that spoke of violence held in check, of power that didn't need to announce itself with flexed muscles or raised voices. For a moment, Tank hesitated, his street-smart instincts warring with his professional obligations to his employer. Last warning, Tank said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. Walk away now, or I'm going to have to hurt you, and trust me when I say you don't want that kind of trouble. Instead of backing down, Seagal took a step forward, his movements so fluid and controlled that it seemed almost casual until Tank realized that the distance between them had suddenly become dangerously small. Son, Seagal said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining basic facts to a slow student. I've been hurt by experts in places you can't even pronounce, and I'm still here, so if you think you're going to intimidate me with promises of violence, you're going to be disappointed. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Tank felt his professional pride flare into anger. He had built his reputation on being the man other dangerous men feared, and no one, especially not some aging stranger, was going to make him look weak in front of his employer. He moved with the explosive speed that had made him a legend in underground fighting circuits, his massive fist driving towards Seagal's head with enough force to shatter concrete. But Seagal wasn't there anymore. He had flowed to the side like water around a stone, his movement so economical and precise that Tank's punch whistled harmlessly through empty air before the bigger man could recover. Seagal's hand closed around his wrist with the crushing grip of a mechanical vice, while his other hand delivered a precise strike to a pressure point just above Tank's elbow. The effect was immediate and devastating. Tank's entire arm went numb from shoulder to fingertips, his hand opening involuntarily as nerve pathways shut down like circuit breakers under overload. He stumbled backward, his face a mask of shock and confusion as he stared at his useless limb. Neural pressure point, Seagal explained conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather. Affects the brachial plexus, temporarily disrupts motor function. You'll get feeling back in about 20 minutes, assuming you don't do anything else stupid. He looked into Tank's eyes with something that might have been sympathy. You're not the enemy here, son. You're just working for one. Tank clutched his dead arm against his chest, his professional confidence shattered like glass against concrete. For the first time in years, he found himself looking at an opponent and seeing not just superior skill, but a completely different category of fighter, someone who had learned violence in places where mistakes meant death and survival required a level of precision that sport fighting could never teach. Around the room, patrons sat frozen in their chairs, their faces masks of shock and fascination as they witnessed something they had never seen before: the casual dismantling of Dominic, Moretti's primary enforcer, by a man who had barely seemed to exert himself. Marina gripped the edge of a nearby table so hard her knuckles turned white, while Detective Coltrane's hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon. Moretti's smile had vanished, replaced by an expression of cold fury that made the temperature in the room seem to drop by 10 degrees. He set down his wine glass with deliberate care, his movements carrying the controlled precision of someone fighting to maintain composure in the face of an unprecedented challenge to his authority. Impressive, he said, his voice carrying the silky menace of a rattlesnake preparing to strike. Very impressive indeed, but you've just made the biggest mistake of your life, old man, because now this isn't just about spilled wine anymore. Now this is about respect. And in my city, disrespect has consequences that extend far beyond a single evening. Seagal turned his attention from Tank to Moretti, his eyes carrying the kind of cold fire that had once made enemy soldiers surrender without firing a shot. Your city. He repeated the words like they tasted bitter in his mouth. Funny thing about claiming ownership of places and people, it only works as long as everyone agrees to pretend you're as dangerous as you think you are. The challenge hung in the air between them like a loaded gun, and every person in the Velvet Lily understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long. After the last notes of jazz had faded into the humid New Orleans night, the old order was about to be tested, and everyone present would have to choose which side of history they wanted to be on. Moretti stood slowly, his hand moving toward the inside of his jacket where those who knew him understood. He kept a knife that had tasted blood more times than most people could count. "Let me show you how we handle disrespect in New Orleans," he said, his voice carrying the promise of violence that had kept an entire city walking on eggshells for far too long. The moment stretched like a guitar string under tension before snapping into explosive action. Dominic Moretti's hand emerged from his jacket, clutching a switchblade that gleamed like a silver fong under the amber lights of the Velvet Lily. The blade locked into position with a metallic click that seemed to echo through the stunned silence like the sound of a coffin closing. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who had used edged weapons to settle disputes since he was old enough to hold one. "Time for your education, old man," Moretti hissed as he lunged forward, the knife describing a vicious arc toward Seagal's throat with the kind of precision that spoke of countless practice sessions in back alleys and abandoned warehouses. His eyes held the cold fire of someone who had crossed the line from intimidation to murder and found the crossing easier than he had expected. But Steven Seagal had seen death approaching in 1,000 different forms across battlefields and backstreets in countries most people couldn't find on a map, and Moretti's attack, while vicious, was also predictable, telegraphed by micro-expressions and body language that Seagal read like words on a page. He shifted, his weight flowed to the side, and caught Moretti's wrist in a grip that stopped the blade inches from his throat. The room erupted into chaos as tables overturned and chairs scattered like leaves before a hurricane. Patrons scrambled for the exits, their elegant evening transformed into a nightmare of violence, and broken glass. Marina pressed herself against the bar, her father's crystal stemware crashing around her like frozen tears, while Celeste stepped down from the stage, her voice finally silenced by the raw brutality unfolding before her. Detective Ray Coltrane surged to his feet, his service weapon appearing in his hands with the practiced speed of someone who had drawn it in anger more times than he cared to remember. "Police," he shouted, his voice cutting through the pandemonium like a blade. "Everyone stay where you are. Nobody moves until I sort this out." But the confrontation between Seagal and Moretti continued with the deadly intensity of a duel fought with surgical precision rather than brute force. Seagal twisted Moretti's wrist with mechanical efficiency, applying pressure to nerve clusters that made the crime boss's fingers spasm and release the knife. The blade clattered across the hardwood floor, disappearing under an overturned table. Moretti staggered backward, his face a mask of shock and rage as he cradled his injured wrist against his chest. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled. "I own this city. I own the cops, the judges, the prosecutors. There's nowhere you can hide from what's coming." "I'm not hiding," Seagal replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had made peace with violence long ago. "I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere until we settle this properly." He advanced on Moretti with the patient, stalking pace of a predator that had cornered its prey. "You wanted to show me how you handled disrespect, so show me." Moretti grabbed a wine bottle from the nearest table, swinging it like a club with the desperate fury of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. The bottle caught the light as it arced toward Seagal's head, trailing droplets of expensive burgundy like drops of blood. But again, Seagal wasn't where the attack expected him to be. He ducked under the swing, caught Moretti's extended arm, and delivered 3 precise strikes that landed with the sound of hammers against meat. The first blow caught Moretti in the solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs in an explosive gasp. The second strike found the cluster of nerves just below his ribs, sending lightning bolts of agony through his nervous system. The third and final blow was a straight punch to the jaw that snapped Moretti's head back and sent him crashing into a nearby table. The table collapsed under Moretti's weight, sending crystal glasses and silver candlesticks cascading across the floor in a symphony of destruction. The crime boss lay motionless for a moment, his expensive suit torn and stained with wine and blood. While his empire of fear crumbled around him like a house of cards in a hurricane, Seagal stood over him, breathing controlled and steady despite the violence, his clothes barely disturbed by the confrontation that had just redefined the power structure of New Orleans' criminal underworld. "This is how we handle bullies where I come from," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room. We don't negotiate with them, we don't enable them. And we sure as hell don't let them terrorize decent people. Tank Baptiste watched from his position against the wall, his dead arm hanging useless at his side, while his mind processed what he had just witnessed, the casual dismantling of a man he had considered untouchable, the demonstration of a level of skill that made his own reputation seem like a child's boast. Somewhere deep in his chest, something that had been dormant for years began to stir. A memory of what it felt like to respect strength rather than fear it. Marina emerged from behind the bar, her legs shaking with adrenaline and relief as she surveyed the wreckage of her father's club tables. Overturned glasses shattered the old order literally and figuratively in pieces around her feet, but for the first time in years the fear that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the settling debris and the distant sound of sirens approaching through the humid New Orleans night. "Is it really over?" Seagal looked down at Moretti, who was beginning to stir, groaning as consciousness returned along with the pain of his injuries. "For him, maybe," Seagal said, "but the real work starts now, the work of rebuilding something better from the pieces of what came before." Detective Coltrane approached cautiously, his weapon still drawn, but pointed toward the floor, his eyes taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had investigated countless crime scenes. "I should arrest you," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Technically, you just assaulted a man in front of 50 witnesses. Technically," Seagal replied. "I defended myself against an armed attacker who had already demonstrated his willingness to use violence against innocent people. And if those 50 witnesses have any sense, they'll tell you exactly what they saw, which was justice being served the old-fashioned way." Moretti struggled to his feet, his face a bruised and bloody mask of hatred and disbelief. "This isn't over," he slurred through swollen lips. "You think one fight settles everything? You think you can just walk into my city and change the rules that have been in place for decades? I don't think anything," Seagal said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "I know that your time is finished, that your reign of terror ends tonight, and that these people are going to rebuild something better from the ashes of your empire." The sirens were getting closer now, their wailing voices promising that the outside world was about to intrude on the private kingdom that Moretti had built inside the Velvet Lily. And as the crime boss looked around the room at faces that no longer showed fear, he began to understand that more than his body had been broken in the fight, his power, his authority, his very identity had been shattered as completely as the crystal glasses scattered across the floor. The wailing sirens grew louder as New Orleans Police Department patrol cars converged on the Velvet Lily, their red and blue lights painting the historic brick walls in alternating colors of authority and chaos. Detective Ray Coltrane holstered his weapon and moved toward the entrance, his mind racing as he calculated the political implications of what had just transpired. Half the responding officers would be honest cops who saw a chance to finally bring down an untouchable criminal, while the other half would be on Moretti's payroll and looking for ways to spin the situation in their benefactor's favor. The first officers through the door were Sergeants Maria Valdez and Kevin O'Brien, two veterans whose reputations for integrity had kept them off Moretti's Christmas card list. Valdez surveyed the wreckage with sharp eyes that missed nothing, while O'Brien began separating witnesses and potential suspects with the methodical efficiency of someone who had worked dozens of similar scenes. Ray Valdez called out, recognizing Coltrane despite his civilian clothes. "What's your status here, witness or investigating officer?" Her question carried layers of meaning. Both knew that Coltrane's answer would determine how the official report would read and whose version of events would carry the most weight. "Witness," Coltrane replied, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his career. "Off-duty witness who saw Dominic Moretti assault a civilian employee with deadly force before being subdued by this gentleman." He gestured toward Seagal, who acted in defense of others. The room stirred as patrons realized that the moment of truth had arrived, the moment when they would have to choose between the comfortable cowardice that had defined their relationship with Moretti and the uncertain courage that Seagal's intervention had made possible. Conversations began in whispers, then grew louder as people found their voices. Jack stepped forward from behind the bar, his young face set with determination that surprised even him. "I saw everything," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the room. Mr. Moretti grabbed Luis Hernandez by the throat, slammed his face into a table, and broke his nose over. I accidentally spilled drink. Then he threatened the whole room with a knife. When this man, he pointed to Seagal, tried to intervene. His words seemed to break a dam that had been holding back years of suppressed testimony. Celeste moved closer. To the police officers, her elegant dress torn and stained with wine, but her voice steady. "I've been singing here for 3 years," she said, "and I've watched that man terrorize employees and customers alike, while everyone pretended not to see it because we were all too scared to speak up, but not anymore." Marina Dubois stepped into the circle of light created by the police flashlights, her father's club in ruins around her, but her spine straight, with a pride she hadn't felt in years. "My name is Marina Dubois, and I own this establishment," she announced. "And I want to file formal charges against Dominic Moretti for assault, extortion, and conspiracy to terrorize my employees and customers. I have documentation of payments I was forced to make and threats I received." Elias Washington pushed through the crowd, his 73-year-old frame moving with surprising speed as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small recording device. "I've been taping conversations for 6 months," he said, his gruff voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had finally played his trump card. "Thought maybe someday someone would want to hear what really goes on in this place. Turns out I was right." The momentum was building like a jazz improvisation where each musician added their voice to create something larger than the sum of its parts. More witnesses stepped forward, each one emboldened by the courage of those who had spoken before them. The socialite, who had accidentally bumped into Luis, tearfully admitted she had remained silent while watching the assault. The businessman from table 12 produced cell phone video of Moretti's attack. The elderly couple near the stage offered to testify about years of witnessed intimidation. Detective Valdez looked around the room with growing amazement at the volume of evidence suddenly being offered by people who had been silent for years. "This is quite a collection of testimony," she said. "But I have to ask, where were all of you 6 months ago, or a year ago, when you could have come forward and prevented tonight's violence?" "Scared," Marina answered simply. "We were all scared of what would happen if we spoke up, scared of retaliation, scared of making things worse, scared of being left alone to face his revenge." Her voice strengthened as she continued, "But watching this man," she gestured toward Seagal, "stand up when everyone else stayed seated, it reminded us that silence in the face of evil isn't just cowardice, it's complicity." Tank Baptiste had been listening to the testimonies with growing unease, his loyalty to Moretti warring with something deeper, something that remembered what it felt like to fight for honor instead of fear. He looked down at his employer, who sat nursing his injuries and plotting revenge, and realized that he no longer recognized the man he had been protecting. "I want to make a deal," Tank announced, his voice cutting through the conversations like a blade. "I've got information about Mr. Moretti's operations, things the police have been trying to prove for years, and I'm willing to trade that information for immunity and a chance to start over." Moretti's head snapped up, his swollen eyes blazing with betrayal and fury. "Tank, you son of a bitch," he snarled. "After everything I've done for you, after all the money I've paid you, you're going to sell me out to these badge-wearing parasites? You didn't do anything for me." Tank replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. "You bought my services like you bought everyone else's, but you never owned my soul. And tonight, I remembered what it feels like to respect someone instead of fearing them." He looked towards Seagal with something approaching gratitude. "This man showed me that strength doesn't have to be used to hurt people, that power can be used to protect instead of terrorize." Detective O'Brien began reading Moretti his rights, while Valdez coordinated with the arriving forensics team to document the scene. The crime boss's threats had lost their power, reduced to the desperate ravings of a man whose empire was collapsing around him. His connections in the police department suddenly seemed less reliable as honest cops smelled blood in the water and began choosing sides. Luis Hernandez emerged from the kitchen, supported by Dr. Rousseau, who had arrived during the chaos to tend his injuries. His face was swollen and bandaged, but his eyes held a light that hadn't been there before. "I want to press charges too," he said, his voice muffled but determined. "And I want to thank the man who stood up for me when no one else would." Seagal nodded acknowledgement, but remained characteristically quiet, allowing the people of New Orleans to find their own voices and tell their own stories of courage and redemption. The police led Moretti toward the door in handcuffs, his expensive suit torn and stained his empire of fear reduced to nothing more than criminal charges and witness testimony, as the patrol car, carrying Moretti, disappeared into the humid night. Marina looked around her father's club, seeing it not as the crime scene it had become, but as the foundation for something better, something that honored the music and magic that had originally brought people together. In this place, what happens now? She asked, the question directed at everyone and no one, as the reality of their collective action began to sink in. What do we do with the freedom we've just won? Seagal finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen communities rebuild themselves from the ashes of corruption. Now you do the hard work, he said, the work of staying brave when the cameras are gone and the headlines have moved on to other stories, the work of building something worth protecting. The aftermath unfolded with the methodical precision of a crime scene investigation as Detective Valdez coordinated the collection of evidence and witness statements, while her partner O'Brien managed the growing crowd of reporters and photographers who had somehow materialized outside the Velvet Lily, like vultures drawn to carry in the story, was already spreading through New Orleans social media networks and police scanners, carrying the news that the untouchable Dominic Moretti had finally been touched. Inside the club, Marina Du Bois stood beside the wreckage of Table 12, where Moretti had demonstrated his cruelty one final time, but instead of despair, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. A sense of ownership that went beyond legal documents to encompass the deeper truth that this place belonged to the people who had found their courage within its walls. Celeste approached the damaged microphone and began to sing without accompaniment, her voice rising through the humid air with a strength that seemed to draw power from the very foundation of the building. She sang about redemption and second chances, about the long road from darkness to light, and every person in the room understood that they were witnessing more than the end of a criminal's reign. They were witnessing the birth of something new. Luis Hernandez sat in a chair near the stage, his face bandaged, but his posture straight, with a dignity that pain couldn't diminish. Dr. Russo had confirmed that his injuries, while painful, weren't life-threatening, and the young waiter had refused additional pain medication, insisting that he wanted to be fully present for whatever came next. I want to say something, Luis announced, his voice carrying clearly despite the swelling around his nose. 6 months ago, I came to this city with nothing but hope and a willingness to work hard. I thought that was enough, but tonight I learned that sometimes hope requires courage. And courage requires people willing to stand together. He looked towards Seagal with gratitude that words couldn't fully express. Thank you for showing us what that looks like. Jax moved through the crowd, collecting glasses and straightening overturned chairs, his actions automatic, but his mind processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. For 4 years, he had watched injustice unfold in silence, telling himself that survival required compromise, but tonight he had discovered that some compromises cost more than they save. Mr. Seagal, he called out as the older man prepared to slip quietly toward the exit. I need you to know that what you did tonight, it didn't just save Luis, it saved all of us from becoming the kind of people who stand by and watch evil happen without lifting a finger. Detective Coltrane approached Seagal with the measured steps of someone who had spent the evening reevaluating everything he thought he knew about courage and consequences. His badge felt heavier in his pocket, weighted with the responsibility of following through on the opportunity that violence had created. The district attorney is going to want to talk to you, Coltrane said, as the primary witness to Moretti's assault and the person who subdued him. Your testimony is going to be crucial to making sure he stays locked up. He paused, studying Seagal's weathered face. But I have a feeling you're not planning to stick around for the legal proceedings. Seagal's lips curved in the smallest suggestion of a smile. I've done what I came here to do, he said. The rest is up to the people who live here, the people who have to decide what kind of community they want to build from the pieces of what came before. Tank Baptiste sat alone at a corner table, his injured arm immobilized in a makeshift sling while he watched the celebration unfold around him. His world had been turned upside down in the span of a few violent minutes, but for the first time in years, he felt something approaching peace. The weight of Moretti's expectations had been lifted from his shoulders, leaving room for possibilities he had forgotten existed. I never thanked him, Tank said to no one in particular, his voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering that strength could be used for protection instead of intimidation. The man who showed me that being tough doesn't have to mean being cruel, that power can be used to build instead of destroy. Marina approached the small group that had gathered around Seagal, her father's club in ruins. But her heart lighter than it had been in years. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You gave us something more valuable than safety. You gave us back our self-respect, our ability to look at ourselves in the mirror without shame. You don't need to thank me," Seagal replied, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had found peace through action. "You found your own courage. It was always there waiting for the right moment to emerge. Sometimes it just takes someone willing to go first to show others that standing up is possible." Outside the broken windows of the Velvet Lily, the humid New Orleans night pulsed with the rhythm of a city that had just discovered it didn't have to accept corruption as the price of survival. The news of Moretti's arrest was spreading through neighborhoods that had lived under his shadow for years, carrying with it the promise that change was possible even in places where hope had been systematically crushed. Detective Valdez finished her preliminary report and approached the group with the satisfied expression of someone who had just closed a case that had been haunting her department for years. "We've got enough evidence to put Moretti away for decades," she announced. "Conspiracy to commit extortion, assault with a deadly weapon, witness intimidation, the list goes on. And with Tank's cooperation, we'll be able to dismantle his entire operation." The crowd began to thin as witnesses completed their statements and drifted back into the night, carrying with them the memory of what they had witnessed and the responsibility of preserving what they had helped create. The Velvet Lily would need extensive repairs before it could reopen, but the foundation remained solid, built on music and hope rather than fear and compromise. Elias Washington approached Seagal with the slow dignity of someone who had lived long enough to recognize historical moments when they occurred. "In all my years," the elderly doorman said, "I've never seen anything like what happened here tonight." One man standing up and reminding an entire room full of people what courage looks like. "It wasn't one man," Seagal corrected gently. "It was everyone who chose to speak up, everyone who decided that silence wasn't an option anymore, everyone who realized that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing." As the last of the police cars departed and the reporters dispersed to file their stories, Marina stood in the doorway of her father's club, looking out at the French Quarter with eyes that saw possibility instead of threat. For the first time in years, she began to plan not just for survival, but for the kind of establishment her father had dreamed of, a place where music could flourish without the shadow of fear. Seagal gathered his simple belongings and moved toward the exit with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to departing without fanfare. His work here was finished, but the work of rebuilding would continue long after he was gone, carried forward by people who had rediscovered their own capacity for courage. "Where will you go now?" Marina asked as he reached the door, her voice carrying genuine curiosity about the mysterious man who had changed so many lives in the span of a single evening. "Wherever I'm needed," Seagal replied, his words carrying the weight of someone who had accepted a lifetime mission of standing between predators and their prey. "There are always more Morettis in the world, and there are always more people who need to be reminded that they don't have to live in fear." He stepped out into the humid night air and disappeared into the shadows of the French Quarter, leaving behind a community that had been transformed by violence into something stronger and more beautiful than what had existed before the old order had fallen, and in its place something new was being born, something built on the simple but revolutionary idea that ordinary people could choose courage over comfort, and that standing together they could overcome any darkness that threatened to consume their light. 1 week after the night that changed everything, the Velvet Lily Jazz Lounge stood transformed not by expensive renovations or architectural changes, but by something far more fundamental. The atmosphere itself had shifted from oppressive fear to vibrant possibility, as if the very air had been cleansed of the poison that Dominic Moretti's presence had spread through every corner of the historic establishment. The broken tables had been replaced, the shattered crystals swept away, and the bloodstains scrubbed from the hardwood floors, but the real transformation was visible in the faces of the people who worked and gathered there. Marina Dubois moved through the crowded room with a confidence that seemed to radiate from her very core. Her elegant frame no longer carried the tension of someone constantly looking over her shoulder for signs of approaching threat. Instead, she walked with the measured grace of someone who had reclaimed ownership not just of a business, but of her own destiny. The midnight blue dress she wore was similar to the one from that fateful Friday night But now it seemed to flow with her movements rather than constraining them like armor against an uncertain world. The stage, where Celeste had once sung with trembling voice, now hosted a celebration of renewal as musicians from across New Orleans came to perform in the club that had become a symbol of resistance against the forces that sought to corrupt the city's soul. Tonight was special, a jazz night dedicated to new beginnings, where every note carried the weight of hope and every rhythm pulsed with the heartbeat of a community that had remembered how to stand together. Luis Hernandez moved through the crowd with quiet pride, his face still bearing the fading evidence of Moretti's brutality, but his posture straight with a dignity that pain couldn't diminish. Marina had promoted him to floor manager, a decision that spoke to both his courage and her commitment to rewarding those who had stood up when standing up mattered most. He wore a simple black suit that made him look older than his 23 years, but his eyes held the bright determination of someone who had discovered his own strength. Ladies and gentlemen, Luis announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. Tonight we celebrate not just the reopening of the Velvet Lily, but the courage of ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when the moment demanded it. His words were met with applause that seemed to come from the very soul of New Orleans, a city that had always understood the power of music to heal wounds and transform pain into beauty. Behind the bar, Jax Tran worked with the efficiency born of pride rather than mere professionalism. His movements as he mixed drinks and served customers carried the confidence of someone who no longer had to compromise his integrity for his paycheck. The tips were better now that the club attracted customers who came for the music rather than to conduct business in the shadows. But more importantly, Jax could meet his own eyes in the mirror behind the bar without feeling ashamed. "You know what's funny?" Jax said to a regular customer who had returned for the first time since Moretti's arrest. "This place used to scare me. Even though I worked here every day, I was always looking over my shoulder waiting for something terrible to happen. But now it feels like home, like the kind of place my grandfather would have been proud to see me working." Detective Ray Coltrane sat at a corner table, nursing a scotch and watching the celebration with the satisfied expression of someone who had finally done the right thing after years of moral compromise. The district attorney had been true to his word, using Tank Baptiste's testimony and the mountain of evidence collected that night to build a case that would keep Moretti locked away for the rest of his natural life. The corrupt cops who had been on the crime boss's payroll were facing their own charges, while the honest ones like Coltrane found themselves with room to breathe for the first time in years. "Hard to believe it's only been a week," Coltrane said to Elias Washington, who had joined him at the table, bringing with him 2 glasses of the club's finest bourbon. "Feels like we've been living in a different world since that night, like someone lifted a curse that had been hanging over this place for too long." Elias nodded, his weathered face creased with satisfaction as he raised his glass in a silent toast to absent friends and hard-won victories. "73 years I've been walking this earth," he said, "and I've seen a lot of things that made me wonder if good could ever really triumph over evil. But that night, watching that man stand up when everyone else stayed seated, it reminded me that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to go first." The crowd stirred as a familiar figure entered through the front door. Tank Baptiste moved slowly, his injured arm still in a sling, but his massive frame no longer carried the menacing presence that had once made customers nervous. Instead, he seemed almost diminished, not by physical weakness, but by the removal of the anger and violence that had defined his professional identity for so many years. He had come not to threaten or intimidate, but to apologize. "I know I don't have any right to be here," Tank said, his voice carrying the humility of someone who had discovered that strength without honor was just another form of weakness. "But I needed to see what this place looked like when it wasn't poisoned by fear, and I needed to say something to the people I helped terrorize for too long." Marina approached him with the measured caution of someone who had learned to trust carefully, but her expression held more curiosity than fear. "What did you want to say?" she asked, her voice neutral but not hostile, allowing him the space to choose who he wanted to be in this moment of reckoning. "That I'm sorry," Tank replied, his words simple, but carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "I told myself I was just doing a job, just following orders, just trying to survive, but the truth is I chose to be part of something that hurt innocent people, and I can't undo that, but I can make sure it never happens again." The room had grown quiet as patrons recognized the significance of what They were witnessing the man who had once been Moretti's enforcer publicly acknowledging his complicity and seeking not forgiveness, but the chance to be better than he had been. The silence stretched for a moment before Luis stepped forward, his bandaged face serious, but not unkind. "We all made choices we're not proud of," Luis said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned that courage could be found in the most unexpected places. "The question isn't what we did when we were scared. The question is what we do now that we remember how to be brave." Tank's eyes filled with something that might have been tears as he realized that redemption might be possible even for someone who had spent years being the monster in other people's nightmares. He nodded once, a gesture that seemed to encompass gratitude and determination in equal measure before turning and walking back into the humid New Orleans night. Celeste returned to the stage, her voice rising through the celebration with a new song she had written about second chances and the long road from darkness to light. The lyrics spoke of broken people finding wholeness, communities healing from old wounds, and the transformative power of standing together against the forces that sought to divide and conquer. As the evening progressed and the music flowed through the Velvet Lily like a river of liquid gold, the patrons began to share stories of their own small acts of courage inspired by what they had witnessed a week earlier. The businessman from Table 12 had reported corruption in his own company. The socialite who had bumped into Luis had started volunteering at a shelter for victims of domestic violence, and the elderly couple near the stage had begun attending city council meetings to advocate for better police oversight. "You know what I realized," Marina said as she addressed the crowd during a break between sets. "That night we all thought we were just witnesses to something extraordinary, but we were wrong. We weren't witnesses, we were participants. We were all part of something bigger than ourselves, something that proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort." The applause that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, as if the club itself was celebrating the transformation that had taken place within its walls. The Velvet Lily had become more than a jazz lounge. It had become a symbol of what was possible when communities refused to accept corruption as the price of survival. Outside the windows, the French Quarter pulsed with its eternal rhythm, but something had changed in the way people walked the streets, carried themselves through their daily lives. The story of what had happened at the Velvet Lily had spread through the neighborhoods like wildfire, carrying with it the message that standing up to bullies was not only possible, but necessary. As the celebration continued into the humid night, Detective Coltrane found himself thinking about the mysterious man who had catalyzed everything, the man who had appeared without fanfare and disappeared just as quietly, leaving behind a community transformed by his example of what it meant to choose action over apathy, courage over cowardice, and justice over the easy compromise of looking the other way. The train rolled through the Louisiana Bayou country with the gentle rhythm of steel wheels on track, carrying its passengers through a landscape that seemed suspended between past and future, where ancient cypress trees draped in Spanish moss stood sentinel over waters that reflected both the sky above and the secrets buried beneath. Steven Seagal sat in a window seat near the back of the car, his simple duffel bag resting in the overhead compartment, while a worn paperback novel lay open but unread in his lap. 3 days had passed since he quietly left New Orleans, slipping away from the Velvet Lily in the early morning hours while the city still slept off the celebration of its newfound freedom. He had checked out of his modest hotel room, settled his bill in cash, and walked to Union Station, where he purchased a ticket on the first train heading west toward whatever destination required his particular combination of skills and moral certainty. The landscape outside his window changed slowly from the urban sprawl of New Orleans to the rural parishes where time seemed to move at the pace of growing seasons rather than news cycles. Small towns flashed past their main streets empty except for the occasional pickup truck or wandering dog, while fields of sugarcane stretched toward horizons that promised endless possibility. His phone buzzed with an incoming text message, the first communication he had received since leaving the city behind. Detective Coltrane had somehow obtained his number, probably through channels that Seagal preferred not to think about too carefully. The message was brief, but carried the weight of genuine gratitude and the promise of justice finally served. Case sticking. Moretti pleaded guilty to avoid death penalty. Tank's testimony bringing down the whole organization. Cities changing for the better. Thought you'd want to know. Seagal allowed himself the smallest satisfied smile as he read the words. then deleted the message and returned the phone to his jacket pocket. Some stories were meant to end with justice rather than vengeance, with communities healing rather than cycles of retribution continuing into the next generation. The people of New Orleans had found their courage, and that was worth more than any individual victory. The train made a brief stop at a small station where an elderly woman boarded, carrying a basket of fresh bread that filled the car with the scent of home. In comfort, she took the seat across the aisle from Seagal, and after a few minutes of comfortable silence began to share stories of her grandchildren and the small victories that made life worth living. "You heading somewhere special?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of genuine interest that seemed to be disappearing from a world increasingly focused on digital connections rather than human ones. "We're just traveling to see what's out there." "Just traveling," Seagal replied, his voice carrying the peaceful tone of someone who had found a purpose that didn't require a specific destination. "Sometimes the journey is more important than knowing where you're going to end up." The woman nodded with the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to understand that life's most important lessons often came from unexpected encounters and unplanned detours. "My husband used to say that the road teaches you things that staying in one place never could," she said. "Course he was a traveling salesman, so he might have been trying to justify all those nights away from home." Seagal chuckled softly, the sound carrying a warmth that surprised him. He had spent so many years focused on discipline and duty that he had almost forgotten how good it felt to simply enjoy a conversation with a stranger who asked nothing more than the pleasure of human company. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the bayou waters in shades of gold and amber, Seagal reflected on the events of the past week and the strange alchemy that transformed ordinary people into heroes when circumstances demanded extraordinary courage. Luis Hernandez had discovered that dignity couldn't be taken, only surrendered. Marina Du Bois had learned that inherited guilt could be transformed into inherited strength, and an entire community had remembered that silence in the face of evil was itself a form of evil. His thoughts were interrupted by the conductor's announcement that they were approaching the next major station where passengers could transfer to lines heading toward Texas, California, or points north. Seagal gathered his belongings with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made countless such transitions. His life organized around the principle that home was wherever he was needed rather than any particular place on a map. "This is my stop," the elderly woman said as the train began to slow. "But before I go, I want to say something. You've got the look of a man who's seen trouble and dealt with it fairly, and I just want you to know that the world needs more people like you, people who stand up when standing up is hard." Seagal helped her gather her things and watched as she made her way slowly down the aisle toward the exit, her words echoing in his mind with the kind of simple truth that cut through years of self-doubt and moral complexity. He had spent so much time questioning his methods, his motivations, his right to interfere in other people's problems that he had almost forgotten the basic fact that sometimes interference was exactly what the situation required. The train resumed its journey toward whatever lay ahead, and Seagal settled back into his seat, allowing himself to enjoy the gentle rocking motion and the hypnotic rhythm of wheels on track. Somewhere behind him, New Orleans continued its ancient dance between corruption and redemption, music and violence, history and hope. But the immediate crisis had passed, and the people who lived there had been reminded of their own capacity for courage. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unknown number that somehow felt familiar. "Mr. Seagal, this is Marina Du Bois. I know you probably don't want to be bothered, but I needed you to know that the Velvet Lily is going to be okay. We're going to be okay because of what you showed us about standing up for what's right. Thank you for reminding us who we could be." He read the message twice, then saved it before putting the phone away again. Some connections were worth preserving, even if they would never be used. The knowledge that good people were doing good work in a place where fear had once reigned supreme was worth carrying forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun touched the horizon as the train carried him deeper into the American heartland, past small towns and endless fields, toward a future that remained unwritten but full of possibility. Somewhere ahead there would be another Luis Hernandez facing another Dominic Moretti in another place where ordinary people had forgotten their own power to choose courage over comfort. Steven Seagal closed his eyes and listened to the rhythm of the rails carrying him forward into whatever tomorrow would bring, secure in the knowledge that he had done what needed to be done and that somewhere behind him a community had been transformed by the simple but revolutionary act of one person deciding to stand up when everyone else remained seated. The train rolled on through the gathering dusk, carrying its cargo of dreams and determination toward destinations unknown, while in the distance the lights of small towns twinkled like stars fallen to earth, each one representing lives being lived with quiet courage and the endless human capacity for hope. Even in the darkest of times, the journey continued, and somewhere ahead, justice waited for its next champion to answer the call. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.